Good evening. What a fantastic turnout. I'll tell you, after the Colbert Report, I didn't know it would get any better, but then I got to come here. So I'm going to have to relish this moment. Thank you all very much for coming. See you guys up there. And I want to thank Dean Rutherford and Skip Rutherford and Eric and Nikolai and Judy and Bob and the lovely people that have made me feel very, very welcome in just the last few hours here. Tonight I'm going to speak for about 30 minutes. I will tell you a little bit about my background and then talk about the recent past. I won't be able to cover the last couple of hundred years of history or even the last 50 years of the Cuban Revolution and U.S.-Cuban relations. I am going to focus on some changes underway in the recent past between 2006, when Fidel Castro stepped aside, and the present in 2009, and I'll speculate a little bit about the future, and I'll focus my thoughts around changes and the relationship between and in Havana, Miami, and Washington. A little bit about my background first. I first went to Cuba in 1984. I was an undergrad at the University of California at Santa Cruz. In 1984 was in the era of the full-blown Soviet subsidy, the full throttle of the Cold War. And I have been traveling back and forth ever since as an NGO staffer, traveling inside of Cuba's prisons and inspecting the conditions for political prisoners and common criminals. Later as a historian, carrying out my dissertation research in Fidel Castro's presidential archive, writing a history of the period of the 1950s, and more recently in my wearing my hat at the Council on Foreign Relations as a policy analyst, sometimes being wined and dined in the palace with Fidel Castro and various members of his cabinet. So all told, we're now in the 50th year of the Cuban Revolution, and when I added up, I realized that I've been watching this place, traveling to this place, trying to take its pulse and get my hands around what's happening there for the last 25 years, for half of that period. And when I do that math, it's kind of shocking. So I'll try to share with you a little bit today about what I think is going on there, what I think we can expect in light of the succession that's underway. We do have a new president, same last name, but a new president in Havana, a new president in Washington, and we do have a new, an emerging, very, very different constellation, or I should say, dimension of public opinion within the Cuban-American community in Miami, and certainly broadly in the country. Before I talk about this Havana, Miami, Washington dynamic of the fairly recent past and future, I do want to set the stage with a little bit of history. Fittingly, so I'll talk a bit about the Clinton administration and Cuba, and also the Bush period that we've just completed in Cuba, and then I'll jump into what we have seen in the very, very recent past. And I mentioned the Clinton administration with a bit of attention, not because of where we are, but it's fitting that we're here. But because this is a period that I think we can draw a number of lessons from, that I think the Cuban regime drew a number of lessons from in terms of possibilities for dealing with Washington, and that the Obama administration might as well. The first key thing to note about the period of the 2 terms of the Clinton presidency in Cuba was the obvious. Fidel Castro was in power and was Washington's primary interlocutor. Very important. Number 2, this was the recent period after the end of the Cold War, and a period when the strategic significance within the Cold War frame for American policy toward Latin America, the strategic significance of Cuba began to decline. Cuba withdrew its support, ceased its support for insurgencies in Central America, was involved, in fact, in those peace processes, same with respect to its troops in Africa, really turned inward and faced the consequences of dramatic external shock that was the collapse of the Soviet bloc, where pretty much overnight the island lost a $4 to $5 billion annual subsidy. And that external shock created an enormous economic crisis, although not the political crisis that some anticipated. And as the strategic significance of Cuba declined, the significance of domestic politics and Cuba in the United States increased. So it's in the period of the 1990s when the Cuban-American vote and Cuban-American financial contributions really do come to frame or at least provide much of the context for American policy toward Cuba. We saw this in the 1992 campaign when candidate Clinton campaigned to bring the hammer down on Castro. He sought and got the endorsement of the hardline Cuban Americans in South Florida and racked up a pretty impressive 32% Cuban American vote on that platform of a hardline toward Cuba in Florida. The state of Florida hasn't stopped being significant. I'll get to it later, but the presidential, those electoral votes with 5, 6, 7% over time of general election voters coming from the Cuban American community make that state incredibly important, as are the campaign finance contributions. So that by way of context. But nevertheless, in the period of the 1990s, the Clinton administration attempted to carry out what was never described as a roadmap, but which was really a roadmap for engagement with Cuba. The premise was that if you unleash people-to-people contact, you broaden the stakeholders in the United States that have an investment in seeing a change in policy toward Cuba, take the focus out of Miami, involve agricultural producers, others from the private sector, culture, religion, education, and arts. And over the period of the decade, we saw and had by the end of the 1990s a pretty impressive flowering of ties between the two societies, including Cuban Americans and their families. And that was probably most dramatized by the Pope's visit, Pope John Paul, who visited in 1998. Many Cubans living here who had never been to Cuba, who hadn't been since they left, went back, saw their families. Even despite the 1996 shoot down by Havana of 2 Cessnas flying over the waters between the two countries, dropping leaflets over Havana, killed 4 people on board. Nevertheless, the administration pretty much kept apace with this vision of trying to diversify the voices in the United States that might have an interest in reaching out to Havana. And Havana played along. Fidel Castro really kind of got what was going on, and although he drew the line on some things, as that shoot down showed, some might say he had no interest in actual full-blown rapprochement and shot the planes down in order to stop it. Nevertheless, the Cuban regime played along. We had a big flow of Cuban academics, artists, dancers, scientific professionals, health professionals coming to the United States, and vice versa. And we called that, I don't know if you guys remember, the Buena Vista Social Club, that music that Ry Cooder produced by the Cuban artists and the film. That was called, I don't mean we, but in Washington and within the State Department and Treasury Department bureaucracy, that was known as the Buena Vista Social Club effect, because it sort of permeated the discussion and changed the discussion and opened up our sensibilities toward this island that more than 100 years ago now, President William McKinley described as having with the United States ties of singular intimacy. So you could say that the Clinton administration tried to rediscover those ties, look beyond the Castro brothers, beyond just the government, and deploy tools in the foreign policy toolbox to reach out to the Cuban people. The Congress followed suit. We had in 2000 the passage of a bill that allowed for agricultural sales that still go on today. In fact, the United States supplies is the 3rd largest supplier of Cuban food imports as a result of that, little known fact. But domestic politics continued to be important, and the Clinton period kind of ended in the Elian Gonzalez conflagration, which had the effect of probably damaging Al Gore's prospects in the state of Florida in a way that were unrecoverable. But the formula of having official ties open, we had annual immigration talks, an immigration agreement, we were starting to cooperate on counter-narcotics, and official ties between the two societies, that formula was pretty satisfactory for the domestic politics in both countries. onto the George Bush administration. What we saw in the wake of 9/11 was, of course, well, prior to the attacks, the Cuban regime took a look at a Republican administration and calculated that perhaps by appealing to its law and order sensibilities, there might be some way for the two governments to work together. So initially, the Cuban government, in a sense, preferring Republicans because they guessed that Republicans would care less about issues of civil liberties and human rights and more perhaps just about matters of law and order, attempted to appeal to that law and order ethos of the GOP. But after the September 11th attacks, the calculus just went awry, because that's when the with us or against us ethos and the regime change frame of the Bush administration really did put the Cuban government on notice. It asked itself whether it was next in line. After all, this is a country that today remains on the US State Department's terrorist list. The language of democracy promotion likewise was associated with imperialism, not just in Cuba, but it came to be the case in Latin America as well. And so the prospect of any kind of rapprochement with the Bush administration and the Fidel Castro government really fell off the wayside. When Venezuela started pumping good financial arrangements of subsidies and barter arrangements into Havana, and Havana deepened its ties with Venezuela, and other left and center-left governments were elected in Latin America, and the global collapse of America's standing sort of gave Cuba company in its critique of American foreign policy. The isolation, the alienation between the two countries was really set. And for the duration of the Bush period, which saw an elimination of the bilateral immigration talks, a virtual cutoff of that people-to-people contact, a virtual elimination of the legal venues for travel by Cuban-American families, domestic politics really did take over, and also ideology. This was an administration, the Bush administration, that I think firmly believed in that it would be the height of betrayal to open up ties with a regime that repressed its citizens, that didn't have an open society, that wasn't a democracy. So there was both belief and politics in the mix up until the very, very end of the Bush administration. I'm going to move now to a little bit more of the present tense, because one of the things that the lack of contact between Havana and Washington did accomplish or produce was, in that summer of 2006, when there was, at the end of July, a very dramatic announcement by Fidel Castro's personal staff secretary that he had handed over provisional power to a group of intimates around him to run the government, led by his brother and a number of others, for some mysterious illness. When that happened, Washington really had no one to call. The relationship between our interest section in Havana and the foreign ministry, those ties were almost not even in person anymore. If they wanted to talk to one another, they sent notes to one another's offices. There was it was a very tense moment, because of course Washington didn't know in July 2006 that there would be such a stable succession. In fact, what was in the documents that the government was producing, and I would say in the fantasy of some in Congress, was that when Fidel stepped aside, whether out of illness or death or election or in any way, there would be total regime collapse. So the expectation was there's going to be a mess, chaos, regime collapse, maybe violence, and yet Washington wasn't prepared for that in any way. Now, let me get to what happened in Havana. Now I'm going to focus on Havana. Excuse me. A little bit before Fidel became sick, he made a very important speech. You know, here we are, American scholars, quoting Fidel's speeches. The speeches tell us a lot, and a little bit before he got ill, he and his foreign minister likewise gave a speech in which they talked about the Cuban Revolution's potential for devouring itself, for collapsing under its own weight, for failing, not because of the embargo or Washington policy, but because of of enormous internal problems, especially on the demographic front. There was a consciousness that this new generation of Cubans now 60% of Cubans were born since the revolution, have no vision of Batista and no memory of the fat days of that Soviet subsidy, have lived with enormous deprivation, but knowledge of the good life that their families in Miami and New Jersey have, and a sense of a desire for opportunity, that young generation really didn't have a buy-in into the revolution. So there was a sense that they were losing it there. Not urgent, not catastrophic, but a consciousness of that. Fidel steps aside, and Raúl, his pragmatic brother who had built many institutions in Cuba, who was a kind of by-the-book military guy, was the person responsible for convincing his brother to open the free farmers markets in the early 90s after the Soviet bloc collapsed and they lost the subsidy, understood that the bread and butter issues on the table were urgent, that without his brother's charisma, he was going to have to start delivering right away. So after taking about 6 months to sort of orchestrate a grand national pulse-taking, get out your dirty laundry, let's have a discussion about what's wrong with our country sort of exercise in workplaces and schoolrooms and universities around the country, he, by February of 2008, when he was ready to take office, he did take office formally in February 2008, gave an inaugural address that told us a lot about what to expect and told his population a lot about what to expect from his presidency. Notably, his speech, that inaugural speech, was 34 minutes long. This compared to the 4 to 5 to 6 hour speeches of his brothers. So in those 34 minutes, he talked about taking steps to improve the spiritual and material lives of the Cuban people. He laid out what can only be described as a state reform agenda, which he wasn't talking about capitalism, he wasn't talking about the market, he was not talking about democracy, but he was talking about things like productivity and efficiency and the unfairness of some people living on the dole and others working hard. He was talking about the need to tolerate a little bit of equality in order to bump up levels of efficiency. And he talked about certain aspects that the state needed to, certain parts of people's lives where the state would be getting out of their way. An agrarian reform followed. He took some small liberalizing measures around allowing people to buy cell phones and get access to foreign hotels, which they had not had access to before. He hinted that they were going to get rid of the requirements that Cubans today still face of having to ask for permission before they travel abroad. That hasn't yet been done. But he did start a slow process of beginning modest and modestly paced initiatives to make people's lives easier. He often sounded more like Margaret Thatcher than Karl Marx in imploring people to work hard, not for the benefit of the state, but for the benefit of, not using the word profit, but productivity. And then the summer of 2008 hit, and the last summer was an excruciating summer globally, but especially for the developing world. You had the global food crisis of skyrocketing prices for food, fuel crisis likewise, and soon after, Cuba was hit by 3 hurricanes in August and September of 2008 that took out 20% of the country's GDP. 20%. The global financial crisis followed right after the hurricanes, and a government and a new president that had looked to have built a consensus internally around eliminating some bureaucracy, privatizing some small state enterprises, giving Cubans much more economic space than they had had probably since the early 1960s. That government suddenly had far less room to maneuver financially. And politically, Fidel Castro stuck around. He not only stuck around, but he got better. He got better, and he occasionally made an appearance, but it became clear that because, at least to me, that because of Fidel Castro's historic and well-known allergy to the market, the reforms that Raúl might have liked to implement were going to take even longer than otherwise because of the combination of the financial crisis, the solvency issue, and his brother being near death and returning. And I just want to take a moment to talk about that. This is an 80-year-old man who almost died, and he's now 83, and he seems to be doing beautifully. Now, that as a personal story is remarkable, but politically, you know, a friend of mine recently said that he's the most aggressive backseat driver he's ever seen in his life. And he could pull the wheel from his brother, reach from the backseat and grab that wheel at any moment. And it's kind of remarkable that he hasn't totally done it. He is not governing, and but he is involved in every single major strategic decision. And that dynamic means that things feel today in Havana as if they're kind of moving as slowly as if through peanut butter. Now, that's not essentially much different than how they always move, or always, I should say, in the last couple of decades since expectations first went up after the collapse of the Soviet bloc. For the potential for rapid change there. But the expectations were lifted by this new presidency of Raul Castro among the Cuban population. And I think that level of expectation for more room to maneuver, more possibility, more opportunity, combined with the election of Barack Obama, combined with a very, very different and much more softened Cuban-American community, creates an environment today in Cuba and in U.S.-Cuban relations that we really haven't seen since. I mentioned that Washington really wasn't prepared for the succession underway, and I'll just say again, Washington was not prepared for this succession. In fact, just before Fidel Castro became ill, Washington, the U.S. government, published the second, not exaggerating, this thick report on how the United States would manage Cuba's transition once there was a transition in Cuba. And it's kind of a nice artifact to read because, but it's an embarrassment too because it tells the reader how little we actually knew about what was going on there. And I think the commission has been disbanded. The office, we had something called the Office of Transition Coordinator at the State Department. This is evocative of the Eisenhower administration, actually, in the 1950s, when the language, if you go back and look at the documents in foreign relations of the United States, the State Department declassified documents, you see Americans talking about how to manage that transition in Havana 50 years ago, and today as well. But we continue to, today even, spend money on radio and TV Marti that Cubans do not listen to because the government blocks it, but nevertheless, we spend the money on it. We spend about $80 million a year now to support democracy promotion programs, and I say that with no disrespect except that the lion's share of that money goes to the cottage industry in Miami of Cuban-American groups trying to work to, you could say, build civil society, you could say overthrow the regime. It's kind of, I don't want to question people's intentions, but it's a waste of money because what we have seen very effectively in Havana is the Cuban government creates groups to, probably in Miami, but certainly in Havana, to infiltrate civil rights and human rights and dissident groups on the island, and to that way learn about Washington's plans to overthrow them. So it's just a kind of unfortunate mess. Jumping ahead, Miami in this recent period has undergone a very significant change. It hasn't manifested in an overwhelming, dramatic change in public opinion by Cuban Americans in terms of their voting patterns. President Obama, by contrast to the 1992 and 96 campaign of President Clinton, who campaigned on a very hard line toward Cuba, candidate Obama campaigned, as you remember, first to talk to adversaries, and second, to campaign that he would eliminate restrictions on family ties and remittances and again begin to reach out to the regime and start a bit of the people-to-people programs that we had. And interestingly, in 2008, Obama won the Cuban American vote with 35% with that new platform. But I stress, only 35% of Cuban Americans voted for Obama. That is to say, Cuban Americans still in large measure vote for a harder line, but public opinion among Cuban Americans is more broadly supportive of an opening not just for families, but for all of us. In that sense, President Obama has much more running room, I think, than his political advisors in the White House would have him as reflected in current policy. What is current policy under the Obama administration? And by the way, national public opinion, I don't know about specifically in Arkansas, but certainly in agricultural states, but nationally, 67%, 70% are the regular numbers coming in the national polls supporting not just people-to-people on the margins kind of stuff, but getting rid of the embargo, lifting the travel ban, full-blown diplomatic relations. And that's been pretty consistent for, I would say, since the year 2000. It might have dipped a little bit in 2003 or so, but it's been pretty consistent nationally for a good decade. And now Cuban American opinion is getting darn close to where national public opinion is. So where are we today? We have, before I get to Washington, let me talk a little bit about Havana. I was in Cuba in February, and right after I left, I was there with a delegation from the Council on Foreign Relations. Raul Castro purged, that's the right word, 3 or 4 of his top figures in the government, in the party, in the foreign ministry, in the economics ministry, the people that dealt with foreign investment, all 4 of whom had been placed and cultivated and trained and brought through the ranks by Fidel Castro. He fired them. He fired them because they were caught on tape talking nasty stuff about their elders. That's the basic way to put it. And in Cuba, you don't do that anywhere, but you don't do that in Cuba when you're in the government. And what happened in that government in the last few years is, I think, a bit of an internal battle over the succession. We didn't see it until those purges came. These were gentlemen who were in their 50s by and large, and they were removed and replaced in some cases by people also in their 50s, but also what Raul has done in consolidating his power is begun to eliminate the parallel structures of government that his brother put in place over the last several decades, and to bring back in the old, the original founding generation. So you now have people who are in their 70s and 80s who have been brought back from retirement and were from the very founding generation of that Cuban Revolution. Part of that has to do with circling the wagons mentality that's always present in Cuba, and part of it has to do with a signal to those coming up the ranks that if you want to climb in this government, you have to go by the rules. You're not going to be plucked from hither or thither and put into place, but you rather have to come in through the bureaucratic norms that are established. So we're seeing, in a sense, more bureaucracy in Havana, and in a sense, less, because they've consolidated ministries. They're going much more aggressively with the agrarian reform. Now we're hearing talk again about, privatizing state enterprises without using that word, but still. In the 90s, they called the economic crisis the special period. There was really nothing there. It was a very terrible time. Blackouts, no gasoline, no lights in the city, hard to get food, a really, really rough time. People suffered nutritional deficits that were so severe that there was neuropathy reported all over the country. It was a very bad time. It's not that bad right now, but the cash crisis and solvency issue that Cuba faces right now, as other countries do in the developing world, is severe, and it's making the pace of change there much slower. Likewise, and I'm going to get to Washington in a second, and I'm speaking more quickly because I feel that I'm running out of time. Is that true? Am I okay? Okay. So Obama comes into office, and if you talk to the people in the White House and in the State Department and the NSC who are running foreign policy, they would probably tell you that the first 6 months of their administration, they did nothing on Latin America but Cuba. They feel really great about having eliminated restrictions on family travel, eliminated restrictions on remittances, gone to the Summit of the Americas, and made it clear that Cuba policy has failed, and we're ready for a new chapter. And they are going to attempt to milk as much political capital out of those initial steps as possible. Now, notably, President Clinton, as I noted, and President Carter went much farther than that. Nevertheless, those steps plus allowing, I would use that word, allowing the OAS member states to vote a resolution rescinding Cuba's expulsion from the OAS in 1962. That step is incredibly important. It was done not without a battle, but it also, as in the April measures, demonstrated that this is an administration that wants to demonstrate a healthy respect for the views of others, especially in Latin America, where President Lula of Brazil, Calderon of Mexico, and others have really insisted, if you're serious about changing the dynamic and America's image here in Latin America, you've got to clean up your Cuba Act. So they've been taking steps to do that. But after those initial steps, we really haven't seen, and they've gotten the immigration talks back on track. But from the Havana's perspective, this is teensy-weensy. I got in trouble for calling this teensy-weensy once, but it's teensy-weensy in the sense that from the point of view of the Cuban regime, they cannot see a clear roadmap coming out of Washington. And in this moment of, I would say, a delicate succession underway, although stable, delicate politically, and a financial crisis that is very, very severe, Washington's moves remain incredibly important. No matter how much deeper the relationship with the EU, the investment from Brazil, from China, the support from Venezuela, the psychological impact of what Washington does or does not do is incredibly important, and it appears to Havana that Washington has moved on. And Washington has moved on because the truth is that the wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq, the instability in Pakistan, the financial crisis here, our domestic agenda, are in fact of much more significant priority. So for Havana to move more rapidly with its own internal reforms, Washington would have to show where it's going, and it hasn't clearly enough. Miami, in a sense, is the least important player these days from the perspective of what I think is going to happen bilaterally. Miami has demonstrated that there's a younger generation that doesn't care so much about Cuba. Obama is popular with Cuban Americans under 35 for reasons that have nothing to do with Cuba. The Cuban American PAC money continues to roll in. I want to change one thing that I said. It's not that Miami isn't important. In fact, I'll reverse that entirely. Washington's got a still overblown perception of the importance of Miami, even as Miami, in my view, is less important than ever from the point of view of the traditional impact of domestic politics or potential impact of domestic politics on the relationship. Last point I'm going to make just to illustrate something, and then I'll take your questions. I think this will continue to move slowly, but it's also the case, and by this I mean the opening between the two countries, it's also the case that both governments are looking for ways to facilitate the opening without it necessarily meaning Raul Castro and Barack Obama sitting in a room together. And here's a great illustration. This Sunday, in Havana, there will be a concert in Revolution Square where the Pope gave his Mass 10 years ago. It's a concert by the Colombian rock pop star named Juanes. Have you ever heard of him? So Juanes is going to Havana with 15 other artists, some of them Cuban, some Latin American, some from Spain, and 600,000 people are expected to perform. Now, what does that have to do with Washington? Well, Juanes lives in Miami, he's Colombian, but in order to pull off this kind of event, he needed to get the buy-in and the support, political and bureaucratic, from both governments in Havana and Washington. And both have done what they needed to do in order to make this happen. And I think that without acknowledging it explicitly or having a discussion about it, this kind of event that's a big cultural event, it's part of his series of concerts called Paz Sin Fronteras, Peace Without Borders. He did one on the Colombian-Venezuela border. He's going to do one on the US-Mexican border. This concert he initially had enormous backlash in Miami and in the Miami media for it, but that's been overcome. This is the kind of thing that both governments can help to facilitate, that can then, I think, pave the way to get the societies back in touch with one another. And you know, that memo that Judy mentioned, it did lay out sort of the full Monty of steps that the Obama administration should take in terms of opening up ties with Cuba. But I have to say, if we could just get back to the strong people-to-people, working together on the neighborhood security issues, and beginning more commerce and travel. You know, the historian in me understands that it took us 50 years to get here. And so I believe it might take us 50 years to get to not a more normal relationship, but certainly a relationship that looks more natural. So I'll stop there and take your questions.
Thank you very, very much. So most of you already know the rules. If you please raise your hand, allow us to recognize you, and then we'll get a mic to you. That way everyone can hear and everyone can participate. So the first one, I guess, is right there.
Yes, thank you for coming. What, in your estimation, is going to happen to Guantanamo Bay should that base be decommissioned?
Thank you for that question, and thank you for coming. I went to Guantanamo in March, and I asked to go there. The United States Southern Command arranged it, and I went not to see the detainees or the prisons because I wanted to see the space, the piece of real estate, the geography, and I think there's a lot of options for Guantanamo, but it's the symbol of American imperial presence in Cuba and in Latin America. We have been there since 1902. We write a check to the Cuban government for $4,000 every year. It doesn't cash the check. Under the terms of the lease, both parties have to agree for it to be amended or changed or ended or altered. The Cubans have been saying for 40 years or something, give it back, and we say no. And when I went there, I can see why. Because it is a gorgeous place. Gorgeous and you know, deep water port, manatees and coral reefs, totally undeveloped. The potential for cooperation has been explored and is now actually being explored at the base between the commander of the U.S. base and his counterpart on the Cuban side in Guantanamo province. There's a military-to-military meeting once a month. The Americans have recently invited the Cubans to come over and watch an exercise because we're building a new refugee facility there. But the Cubans are very uncomfortable about too much effort to convert the base, for example, to a big tropical health and infectious disease research center, one idea that has been floated, because they don't want to concede that they don't have full sovereignty over it. So we have to figure out a way to just give it back, or some sort of roadmap to giving it back in order to make that transition.
Right there.
I was over there in the 90s, and one thing that struck me, you would have scientists working as cooks in private restaurants because they can make $200 a month instead of $25 a month. And it seemed like the economic system just had completely distorted. It didn't make any sense. There was no logic to how people worked. And I was wondering, is that still the case today?
Yes. It is, and it's a source of enormous morale problems. Every few years, they raise wages of those high-value workers to try to keep them in their jobs, but there's a lot of leakage and spill-off. The tourism sector draws, the informal tourism sector and the formal tourism sector continues to draw highly trained professionals. The incentive system is totally perverse, and everyone's aware of it, and they're conscious of the need to fix it, which doesn't mean they're about to fix it.
We had one gentleman over here.
Thank you very much. I would like to know how much you are informed of agricultural development, technological development that has taken place in Cuba, and how much of that has been then shared with other countries. especially biotechnology for fertilizer, biological pest control.
You're probing areas where I might not be able to provide you as much detail as you yourself seem to know. The agricultural sector, in terms of growing stuff that people consume, is not one of Cuba's best exports. They are terribly inefficient in their own production. They import 80% of the food that they consume. You drive around the country and most of it is not cultivated because the land has been in state hands for a very, very long time, and the transition to private and independent farmers is underway only now. There's been a small private growing class for some time, but very, very small. On the biotechnology front, and here, on the fertilizer area, I don't know so much, but in the area of tropical medicines and, for example, generic HIV/AIDS testing, the other tropical infectious disease inoculations, cancer medications for children, basic vaccine packets. On that front, Cuba has been quite successful and produces and markets in joint ventures with developing countries, especially in many parts of the world.
Right there. Just to your right.
Hi, I'd like to ask this gentleman back here that mentioned that he'd been to Cuba, how he got there, because I want to go too. I understand it's illegal.
Well, write your congressman. No, I mean, oh, well, I don't know, ask him. Well, he was probably, my guess, without just guessing, in the 1990s, the Treasury Department gave licenses to religious, educational, artistic, you name it, sort of American NGOs to bring their members. They gave these blanket institutional licenses, and so the Clinton School, the Heifer International could get a license and then bring groups down to Cuba, not for tourism, but to sort of meet with counterpart institutions. I don't know, how did you get there? That was the elaborate people-to-people policy of the Clinton administration.
Here you go, right here.
You mentioned 4 or 5 people who were fired earlier this year from the government. I know one of those individuals, Foreign Minister Perez Roque, was almost a protege of Fidel Castro.
Right.
With the recovery of Fidel, as you were talking about, is there any chance of those people reemerging from wherever they are? And if you know where they are.
I know where some of them are. I rather doubt it. After they were fired, Fidel published in one of his, he publishes them, these reflexiones, reflections, a couple of times a week sometimes, maybe sometimes a couple of times a month. He wrote a very, very nasty piece that alluded to their having been inured by the honey of power. He dismissed them in a very, very unequivocal way. And the next day, Perez Roque and Laje each published a sort of mea culpa in one of the state newspapers. So I would find it hard for, unless he gets the driver, unless he grabs the wheel entirely, and even under those circumstances, I can't imagine that happening. Now, I've heard that Laje is still at home doing nothing. Perez Roque is working on some environmental cleanup project of the Almendares River. Not quite Siberia, but a little bit different than the foreign ministry. And another that's a doctor might be working in a medical clinic. It's very murky.
Hi, my name's Hallie Schaffner. I'm a first-year student at the Clinton School. I'm interested to know the role of women in the Cuban Revolution and how women interact socially and economically today. I've read some Cuban American literature that has both this very strong themes of the strong independent woman and machismo, so it's sort of at the same time.
Yes, you know, that sort of at the same timeness is sort of characteristic of almost everything in Cuba. I mean, it is just a bundle of contradictions in so many different ways. And you asked a huge question, and I'm going to try to answer it very, very, very quickly. I have some personal heroines, actually, that I wrote about in my first book, because they were women who in their 20s and young 30s lost boyfriends and husbands to torture and murder and repression, and were very involved in very risky activity, and used their quite remarkable political capabilities to help organize political support in the United States and in Cuba. So the women's story is an interesting one, and it goes back. Women are more than 50% of the workforce in Cuba. Their professional advancement has been enormous under the revolution, which doesn't mean at all that they're still, as we are as well, cleaning and cooking and having what they call the doble jornada, which is, you know, the double schedule. Machismo still exists. It's a Latin American country, but I would say, you know, when Cuba prides itself on having some of the lowest infant and female mortality rates in the world, and has eliminated most organized prostitution and illiteracy. Well, women are the ones that are the most illiterate in any underdeveloped society. So for women in Cuba, the gains have been enormous, and of course the costs have been enormous too. But also for men in terms of the family separation, the polarization between Cubans here and in the United States. But by and large, it's a pretty positive story.
We have time for one more question.
I am a Cuban, and I'm a witness to the fact that Fidel imitated what was used in China and Russia to reach for the soul of the Cuban people and change it around according to his goals. For instance, with the music of the revolution took the place of the popular music, which only came back now with Buena Vista Social Club. And with religion, practically eliminated in many ways. And the third way was reaching out to change the nature of the relationship within the family. He used committees of defense of the Cuban Revolution, which taught the Cuban people to spy on each other and betray each other. Do you see any evidence of any change in any of those three techniques, among others?
Is this the last question? Maybe one more? You're describing the Cuba of the 1960s and 70s, and honestly, having been traveling there only since 1984, but since that, I mean, I would say that the evidence I see is on the religion front. I mean, you know, in 1992, there was a new constitution that was passed that basically said you can practice any religion and be a believer and hold the highest office in the country. And there's been an absolute flowering of religion: Catholic, Protestant, evangelical, Jewish, Baha'i, Santeria. I mean, it is much more vibrant on the religious front than, I don't know, sir, when you left, but by comparison to that early period when he really did clamp down. On the musical front, too, likewise. I mean, the revolutionary, there is no longer much that I know of, a kind of hardcore socialist propaganda revolutionary music. And that, in the cultural field, things have opened up quite a bit. On the family front, I think that's where it's the toughest. I mean, there are family divisions, there are the economic problems in the country, quite apart from the ideological intent of the government early on, have imposed huge deprivations. And when you have people who routinely, as economic refugees, are leaving the country, that causes dislocation. So I think the family divisions that have resulted from this revolution, people are still paying for that today. But on the other front, I would say the Stalinist period is in the rearview mirror. Now, you could say that I'm wrong, but that's my perspective.
Okay, one more.
we were privileged to spend a couple of weeks in Havana the last year of the Clinton administration. I was doing a cultural exchange program with the Cuban photographers. But the question I have is about the dual economy. I'm assuming it's still rampant, and the U.S. dollar is still the gold standard, if you will, pardon the pun. Is that still in operation there?
That's a great question. I'm glad you raised it. The dual economy is still rampant, but in 2003 or 2004, they eliminated backtracking. In 93, 94, they legalized the possession of the dollar. So it basically became a dual currency country, and to really get anything done, you needed dollars. They eliminated the dollar as the major currency and replaced it with something called the CUC, which is CUC, which is convertible, Unidad Convertible Cubana, something like that. It's a unique Cuban currency that is their version of hard currency. So when we go there with dollars or euros or Canadian dollars, you have to trade them for the CUC. But there's still a dual system, and there's still and it's still the source of enormous inequality and unhappiness.